So my name is Pamela Levy. Again, I'm a reporter at Mother Jones. I have covered a lot of voting rights issues, which I think is why I'm here. I've covered gerrymandering, felon disenfranchisement, voter purges, and the Supreme Court. To my left is Joshua Douglas. He is the Thomas P. Lewis Professor of Law, University of Kentucky College of Law. Go by Josh or Joshua?
Josh.
Josh.
Unless you're my mother.
Not today. Josh teaches and researches election law and voting rights, civil procedure, constitutional law, and judicial decision-making. This is going to be really a lot of people are doing a lot of things here, so brace yourselves. He authored Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. It is here in the flesh. Check it out. His article, Procedural Fairness in Election Contests, was a winner of the 2011-2012 Seals Call for Papers. He's done a lot of stuff. These are going to go a really long time. We only have so much time. He's very important. Check him out.
Thanks, Mom.
Jumping all the way to the other end, we have Rick Hassan. He is the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. Rick is a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance regulation, writing as well in the areas of legislation and statutory interpretation, remedies, and torts. From 2001 to 2010, he served as founding co-editor of the quarterly peer-reviewed publication Election Law Journal. By the way, if you don't follow his election law blog, it is a daily must-read. He is the author of over 100 articles on election law issues, published in numerous journals, very fancy journals. Keep moving on here. He's been named one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America by the National Law Journal in 2013. Jumping back over here to my left, we have Marina Jenkins. She is the litigation director at the National Redistricting Foundation. Prior to that, she worked at Jenner & Block LLP, where she focused on government controversies, public policy litigation, and election law. Jenkins has represented corporate, nonprofit, and individual clients in cases involving voting rights and redistricting, government investigations, and corporate compliance issues, copyright disputes, and human trafficking. She's also very impressive and has had impressive clerkships. Finally, we have Rochelle Ross, the Chancellor's Professor of Law, University of California, Berkeley School of Law. Rochelle's research is driven by a concern about democratic responsiveness and accountability, as well as the inclusion of marginalized communities in the political process. Ross's past scholarship in the areas of election law, constitutional law, and statutory interpretation has been published in the Columbia Law Review, NYU Law Review, and University of Chicago Law Review, among others. He is currently working on 2 book projects, not yet to do 2, not just one. One on gerrymandering and the other on voter data as a tool for disenfranchisement. He's had many illustrious things that I will not read out loud. Cool, so we got through the business. I think we all sort of are aware of voting rights and democracy issues these days, so I don't think I have to do much of an introduction here. The word gerrymandering comes from someone named Jerry, I think, and he died a long time ago. So I think from that we can conclude that it's an issue that's been going on a long time. Fighting for the right to vote has been going on a super long time, and that's obvious. But I do think that starting in 2011, after the 2010 elections, we saw a resurgence of issues dealing with democracy and access to the ballot that were on a different level than we had in recent years. Again, not new, but there was a change. We saw voter ID laws, voter roll purges, ending to things like early voting. The list goes on. Then 2 years later, we had the Shelby County decision, and the trends we had seen over the 2 years prior sort of accelerated. We are dealing with things like precinct closures, a whole host of issues that I think our panelists are going to be discussing. But I also think that the last 2 years have seen some breakthroughs. I think that automatic voter registration and some of the things happening in the states have sort of been a little bit of a new direction sort of seen possible here. And I will also say, I think that President Trump and his claims of voter fraud and then his voter fraud commission sort of forced the press and journalists to sort of start fact-checking things, statements about election fraud and stuff like that, and sort of woke up a lot of people to the fact that there's a lot of misinformation and that there's a struggle going on over voting and over what kind of a democracy we're going to have. So that sort of sets the stage for where we are today. I think, the thrust of this panel, I hope, will be a little bit hopeful because I think we're in a moment of public awareness, and so there's a need for a discussion of where do we go with that. We have a moment, so how do we seize it? All right, timer on. First question. So, Josh, I think that reporters in DC, like myself, sort of go, oh, what's Congress doing these days? But right now, Congress isn't doing that much. There's a little bit of a stalemate. And so I think that when we look at where to go on offense when it comes to voting, I think maybe a big part of that is to actually look at what's going on at the state level. So I'm hoping that you can start by talking a little bit about what's going on at the state level and if that is indeed the place that we should be paying attention to.
Sure. Thanks, Pema, and thanks to ACS for putting on this panel and having all of us up here. So when people talk about the right to vote, I think most people's first reaction is doom and gloom, right? We're making it harder to participate. Voter restrictions are on the rise. Our system is not as inclusive as it needs to be. And that's all true. And that relates to many of the restrictions in many places that you mentioned in your introduction. And yet I actually see cause for hope, and that I see there's a lot of good news out there for voting rights at the state and the local level, so much so that I wrote an entire book about it, and it's not a short book. It's not like one page. That is the good news. So I tell people I wrote a book about the good news in voting rights, and they say, it didn't take very long. But actually, there are a lot of what I call positive voting rights improvements happening all over the place, a lot of them in so-called blue states, but many in places that would be surprising. So we can talk about felon reenfranchisement and this pullback on disenfranchising people for life. And most of you probably heard about Florida, the state's electorate enfranchising 1.4 million returning citizens through a state constitutional amendment. That's a great positive movement to be more inclusive. Now, it's true that the legislature there is now trying to pull back on that. And so what we have is this kind of push and pull for expansions and restrictions. But there's other places, like even in Kentucky, where I live, which has the worst felon disenfranchisement law in the country, the state passed a expungement bill to allow some low-level felons to get an expungement of their records and thereby regain the right to vote. And so even Kentucky's law, which is the worst in the country, or tied for the worst with Iowa now, is made its law just slightly better. And this was all thanks to really an individual, a guy named West Powell, who told his story. He went to speak to the Senate Judiciary Committee in Kentucky and told his story, spoke for about 4.5 minutes about the mistake he had made 25 years ago, and convinced a Republican state legislator to change his mind on felon disenfranchisement, and they got that bill passed. You mentioned automatic voter registration. Started in Oregon. This is where the state takes the responsibility of putting everyone on the voter rolls instead of having to opt in. It's an opt-out system. Started in Oregon, but then spread to places like West Virginia and Georgia, and this has led to a higher turnout in these places. States are making election day itself more convenient through the use of universal vote by mail, or also known as vote at home, where every voter receives a ballot in the mail 2 or 3 weeks before election day, regardless of whether they asked for it or not. This also started in Oregon, spread to Washington State, Colorado, and now Utah. All but one county in Utah uses vote at home. And that last county is hopefully going to change its rules as well, so we could add Utah statewide. We can talk, I know we'll be talking about gerrymandering and redistricting, and there's, yes, some doom and gloom, but also some positive stories with respect to the passage of independent redistricting commissions. There's a movement towards public financing, both at the state level, like in Maine, but also at the local level, such as with democracy vouchers in Seattle. Ranked choice voting is spreading, again, in places that maybe you wouldn't suspect. We just had not only city adoption, but also statewide adoption in Maine. Places like Memphis is about to implement it. Nashville is looking into it. And then I also point to the improvements in civics education, which are actually happening through a movement known as Action Civics, where students are learning real-world examples of how to be a strong participant in democracy and have democratic and civic engagement. It's not just learning about checks and balances, which is probably interesting to most of us in the room, but maybe not to many 16 and 17-year-olds, but really solving real-world problems. There's a whole host of things that are happening at both the state and local level that I think are ways forward to go on the offense and not only be fighting back against voter suppression, but also moving forward to create a system that's a lot more inclusive and democratic.
Thank you. I should have said this ahead, a little bit of business. Even though I'm going to direct some of these questions at each of you, you are all welcome to jump in. So if anyone has anything that they want to jump in and add to what Josh just said, that please do. And I'll sort of lead off by saying that, so some of the things you mentioned are state lawmakers who have decided to sort of move forward on issues like automatic voter registration, for example. And then some of them are things like in Florida with felon disenfranchisement, where the voters had the opportunity to pass an amendment. And I'm curious if you think that one of those is more a path forward than another. Certainly different states have different constitutions, and different, avenues for change. But I'm curious if you see more hope with local lawmakers, or if you see it more with grassroots actions and then a majority of the vote.
So it really depends on the dynamics of the state law. So what's possible in states, some states have the ballot initiative ability to change the laws. Other states require the legislature. But here's the common denominator among all of the positive stories that I talk about in the book, is that they're largely driven by everyday Americans, by individuals who actually have had very little political experience before embarking on this effort. I mentioned the guy in Kentucky, West Powell, who spoke up. The movement for independent redistricting in Michigan was sparked by a Facebook post from a young woman who had never been involved in politics before. The push for ranked choice voting, public financing, AVR, universal vote by mail, all of these things are actually being driven by grassroots activists, whether they're focusing on a ballot initiative, either at the state or the local level, or they're focused on convincing legislators, whether it's the city council or the state legislature. None of these things are happening without the grassroots advocacy of both everyday Americans and then democracy reform groups in each of these places. And so it really depends on the state and what the dynamics of how to change the law are. But again, the common thing I found in researching for the book and researching all these positive voting rights reforms is that it's everyday people who are spending some time on the issues of improving our system.
I think I'll ask you one more question, and if people
Sure.
want to jump in, they can. I think one of the things that is so problematic here in Washington is that voting rights has become, and on some level always was, a partisan issue. And I know that sometimes, those partisan labels can be a little bit jumbled, or, it doesn't work exactly the same way when you're at the local level or the state level. And I'm curious if you've seen breakthroughs, or if you've seen those sort of partisan divides on the issue sort of trickle down into the states and define these things, or if part of the success here and part of the hope is that both parties are working together.
Yeah, so some of the reforms certainly have a partisan balance, or are seen as having helping one side as opposed to the other. And so, it's typically that you see some more of these reforms in so-called blue states or blue cities as compared to red states or red cities. That said, some of these ideas are seeing bipartisan success. So automatic voter registration started in Oregon as a blue state, but then spread to West Virginia and Georgia. And so we see these places where you're seeing, and it's often election officials who say, look, this makes sense because it makes more sense to help our voters. It costs less, and it's better for the overall system. And either politics be damned, or just it's not necessarily going to have such a partisan effect. Universal vote by mail, the same thing, right? Started in some so-called blue states, but you have both, red states, like I said, Utah, and other places like Kansas is going to be, now that we no longer have Chris Kobach as Secretary of State there, is going to be moving, or at least allowing its counties to go for either a vote by mail, or the other reform is vote centers, where instead of having to go to the precinct closest to your home, you can go to any vote center in the county, and they're all connected electronically. So once you check in at one place, you can't go anywhere else, and the ballot that's printed for you is the ballot for your home address. But that increases the convenience factor of voting dramatically, and we see turnout go up in these places. In fact, for vote centers, the guy who came up with it was a Republican county clerk in Larimer County, Colorado, who basically just wanted to make the system better for all voters. So yes, some of it definitely has some partisanship to it, but and also felon reenfranchisement, by the way, is happening in lots of places of diverse politics. So some of it certainly does have politics involved, but some of it, I think, we can see these successes. And my view is, let's go after those wins where we can get bipartisan support and bipartisan success, because that's going to lay the groundwork to get these ideas to spread to other places. And also, states and localities can be models for other parts of the country, such that when 10, 20 years from now, perhaps the politics are different in certain places, we have success stories to point to that can then be adopted in those areas where politically it's perhaps more feasible.
Literal laboratories of democracy.
Yeah, well, and I'll just add one thing. Justice Louis Brandeis once said that states are laboratories of democracy, that, one courageous state can try something new, and if it works, it'll spread. And I like to say that if states are laboratories of democracy, then cities and counties are test tubes of democracy that can try something out on an even smaller scale, and if it works, it'll start spreading. And that's what we're seeing with many of these reforms, like democracy vouchers or ranked choice voting, or even universal vote by mail started first at the county level before it moved statewide.
Hi, I'm Marina. One thing that I would just add to what Josh said, which I think was all wonderful, is that I think that a lot of the ballot initiatives that we saw succeed last year also showed that there's a real appetite from voters on both sides for reform and for progress in this area. And so part of it is, the question of who's pushing it, but then also the question of, is that, are we sort of giving the people what they want, and can we create movements that sort of talk to people in a real way, in a direct way, because I think, in Missouri, there was a Clean Missouri reform that got like nearly 20%, there was like a nearly 20% margin. They succeeded brilliantly in passing a series of ethics and redistricting reform, and just the margin by which that passed, I think really, in a state like Missouri, which is not the most blue state, that it really shows that people like these ideas, and so if you take them to them in a very plain way, that there's an appetite for that.
That's a good point.
Hi, I'm Rick. Thanks to ACS for having me here. This panel was actually supposed to be in January, and I was on an airplane that was supposed to land in Reagan, then got diverted to Dulles, and then got diverted to Baltimore, and then I took a treacherous cab ride from Baltimore Airport, only to find the event canceled and to go home. But that event was supposed to talk about H.R. 1, which had just been passed. And so if states are the laboratories of democracy and cities are the test tubes, then Congress is the black hole of democracy. H.R. 1, Mitch McConnell, H.R. 1 is a comprehensive voting reform, and I think it's, as a political document, in terms of what the Democrats have put out as their marker for what kind of change they'd like to see, it's a very interesting document. But Mitch McConnell has said, not only is H.R. 1 not getting a hearing over in the Senate, but that he's even blocking bipartisan election security measures, which really are desperate. We desperately need funding and more changes to our laws to deal with the problems we saw in 2016, and that's not going anywhere in the Senate. And so it's a very different picture on the federal level, and it's likely to remain this way so long as we have this divided government and a Senate led by someone who is opposed to all election reform.
That's my senator. One thing that is really interesting about H.R. 1, though, is that not everything, but almost everything in H.R. 1 is already being used and implemented in either states or cities around the country. So it's a great example of how you see reforms that we can point to success stories and they're working, and then they get packaged into this federal law that my senator is blocking any debate on. You're welcome.
It's interesting. I mean, I think that, like, logically, if a voter notices that something is working for them on the state level, they would be supportive of it on the national level. But I'm not sure that we're seeing that sort of translate right now. But I mean, is it your view that sort of the more people live with, say, automatic voter registration or vote from home, that they could sort of be like, yeah, this is working well. Why wouldn't I support that nationally? Is that part of your source of optimism here, is a sort of training people on this issue?
I think that's right. And what we see is places that have adopted some of these reforms, they love them. I mean, people in vote-at-home states, by and large, love it on both sides or all sides of the political spectrum. And so the question is, how do we translate that? Now, we have the problem of gerrymandering, which skews things at the federal level, and there's sort of lots of problems. So, I'm an optimist. I'm a realist that there's a lot of doom and gloom out there that is correct. But, my response is not let's just throw up our hands and there's nothing we can do about it. My response is let's do something, and we have success stories already thanks to these everyday Americans, these democracy champions who are pushing many of these reforms where they are possible.
All right, well, that's enough hope for now. So I don't know what this says about the American education system, but I've literally never taken physics, and I graduated from college and high school. But I think this is what lawyers call hearsay. I'm pretty sure through hearsay that if I had taken physics, I would learn that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. That's physics, right? Cool, thanks, guys. So Rick, we talked a lot about all of these things that are moving forward at the state level. Can you talk a little bit about what might happen when these things encounter our court system and how you see that sort of playing out? There's always the first level of enacting it and then the second level of someone suing.
Sure. And so many of you were probably at the first panel where there was mention of the Citizens United case, which was the case that allowed unlimited corporate spending in elections, and the Shelby County case, in which the Supreme Court killed off a key part of the Voting Rights Act. And so my message, if we're flipping the narrative, I'm flipping it back. My message is that I think people grossly underestimate how much worse things can and likely will get with the Supreme Court and with lower courts, thanks to new judges that have been put on the courts, in terms of campaign finance reform, in terms of voting reform, and even in terms of what might be facing us in the upcoming 2020 elections. So let me just talk briefly about each of those. First, on campaign finance. We're right now in a situation where the Supreme Court has said it's unconstitutional to limit spending in candidate elections or ballot measure elections. The only exception to that is foreign spending. And even there, in an opinion by then Judge, now Justice Kavanaugh, those rules are quite limited in terms of what they apply to. So most of the things that Russian operatives did in the 2016 election in terms of trying to influence our election and foment discord are perfectly legal under current law, or the Supreme Court would likely interpret them to be legal. But so spending limits are out, except for foreign individuals. Contribution limits are now being subject to more scrutiny, and disclosure laws are mostly constitutional. I think those latter two things are fairly likely to change over the next decade if we end up with a Supreme Court majority that looks like it does today. Chief Justice Roberts is the median, the middle of the court. There are, I think, at least 3 justices to his right, Gorsuch, Thomas, and Alito, who believed that most campaign disclosure laws are probably unconstitutional. It had been sort of accepted at the Supreme Court that disclosure laws were a good thing, that they were less intrusive than limits. Two of the justices who were the biggest believers in disclosure were Justices Scalia and Kennedy, who both left the court. And so I think we could be in a situation where not only are we having large money coming into our elections, not only are we having some undisclosed money because Congress hasn't fixed the holes in our existing disclosure laws, including probably some foreign money coming in, but we may be in a situation where all money would be disclosed to candidates and to those who have an interest, but not to the general public. So I would not be surprised to see many of our disclosure laws falling as violating a First Amendment right to anonymity or privacy that we could see the Supreme Court recognize. There was just a case, it's not just the Supreme Court, there was just a case where the DC Circuit refused to rehear a case en banc involving the Federal Election Commission. The Federal Election Commission has been quite dysfunctional. I'm sure you've heard those stories before, but the DC Circuit just issued an opinion just a few weeks ago that basically gives the Republican commissioners a way, by claiming prosecutorial discretion, to block judicial review of their decisions not to enforce campaign finance laws. So that's a terrible decision, and it's likely to have repercussions going into 2020 and beyond. These are threats not just to federal laws, but to state and local laws as well. State and local laws, of course, also have to comply with the First Amendment of the Constitution. So Josh mentioned Seattle with their campaign finance vouchers. I've been an advocate for vouchers for over 20 years, but there are some legal challenges to vouchers. And New York City has a very innovative 8-to-1 match for small donations for campaign finance. I'm concerned about the constitutionality of those laws as well before the Supreme Court. As bad as things are with campaign finance, I think they're worse with voting rights. We already saw what the court did in Shelby County with Section 5 of the Act. Last term, at the end of the term, while Justice Kennedy was still on the court, we had an opinion called Abbott versus Perez, which is a case out of Texas, where the Supreme Court has continued on its process of narrowing the scope of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which remains in the Act as the most important part of the Act that's now being enforced. I don't expect we'll see an opinion in the next few years where Section 2 is struck down the way Section 5 was, but same as we might see in other areas, like in the area of reproductive rights. The court has lots of ways of killing a right, including through death by 1,000 cuts, and I think we're going to see the Voting Rights Act be construed in ways that increasingly is going to take its teeth out of it. We're seeing lower courts dividing on the question of whether suppressive voting laws violate the Constitution or violate federal law. We're seeing some judges recognizing interests in preventing voter fraud and instilling voter confidence, despite the fact that there's no evidence that these laws actually do such things. Although the evidence on how much voter ID laws suppress the vote is quite mixed, and I think the effects generally have been quite modest, in part because of counteractions that have been taken in order to deal with the problems. Some of the other laws that are up right now that are being considered have no doubt much more suppressive capacity. For example, Kansas's documentary proof of citizenship requirement to register to vote had led to the suspension of 30,000 new voters until that was put on hold and then ultimately quashed by a federal district court. That case is now on appeal to the 10th Circuit. That case could be headed to the Supreme Court, a Supreme Court that seems to want to give states the power to pass these laws without having to present any proof that these laws are actually necessary to protect the integrity of the vote. There are lots of provisions of H.R. 1 that could be blocked by the courts, including those involving felon disenfranchisement. The issue there would be Congress's power under either the 14th Amendment or under the Elections Clause or under the 15th Amendment to be able to enforce voting laws that empower more people. We seem to have a lot of originalists on the court. They like to look at 1789. They don't like to look too much at the 1860s when we had Reconstruction amendments that fundamentally changed the balance of things. And those, the original intent there seems to be less important. One potential roadblock to using ballot measures, as Pema mentioned, as a way of trying to get redistricting reform and other reforms on the congressional level is a case from 2015 called the Arizona Legislature case versus the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission. The issue in that case was whether only state legislatures can set the rules for congressional elections. It involved Arizona voters over the objection of the Arizona legislature imposing an independent redistricting commission. The Supreme Court, on a 5-4 vote, said that part of the Constitution that says that the legislature gets to set, state legislature gets to set the rules for congressional elections. Legislature there includes the voters acting through the initiative process. It was a 5-4 decision. Justice Kennedy joined the liberals in the majority. The dissent was one of the strongest dissents we've seen by Chief Justice Roberts. He now likely has a 5th vote in Justice Kavanaugh to be able to change that. And so it's possible, for example, that Michigan's redistricting law, once it is put in place to try to change how congressional elections lines are being drawn, could be challenged. The Supreme Court could reverse that. That would have the effect of not only stopping redistricting commissions that have been enacted by initiative applied to congressional elections, but all voting reforms adopted on the state on the state level that affect congressional elections that were not approved by the state legislature. And finally, if I haven't pressed you enough, I'm very concerned, and my current project is about whether American democracy can survive the 2020 elections. And if any of you are old enough to remember Bush versus Gore and how politicized that was, I'll just remind you that that was in the era before Twitter, that was in the era before Donald Trump, and that was in the era before all the conservatives on the court were appointed by Republican presidents and all the liberals on the court were appointed by Democrats. Things would be much more polarized, much more politicized, and I think we really need to start thinking about steps now to assure that we have a peaceful transition of our democracy in 2020 should voters vote in that way. And I don't think it's at all necessary that that's going to happen. It's going to take work to make sure that that happens. And the things that we've taken for granted about the rule of law and the ability of people to, if they lose, take their losses and fight the next fight, I think that's something that we can't take for granted anymore, and we have to make sure that we educate people about what's at stake in the 2020 elections. Was that depressing enough?
That did it. Thanks. So people, actually my follow-up to you had actually been about HR1, so I'll skip that. One thing I would be interested to hear more from you, but other people can feel free to step in. One, I would say to Josh, hopeful thing that happened, I believe it was last year, was that Pennsylvania successfully threw out one of the most gerrymandered maps by going not through federal court, but through state court. I know that the Republicans who were defending those maps tried to move the case to federal court, and I think failed, tried to take it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't bite. And for that reason, Pennsylvania had a new map last year. But don't know, I'm curious whether or not you think that that is an example that will hold, that federal courts will not want to wade into the stuff that you were talking about on some level, which is, states operating under their own constitution and state courts, or whether or not it sounds like you see a lot of the stuff at the state level ultimately being rooted through federal courts and then ultimately, obviously, to the Supreme Court, which is the Supreme Court of all the courts.
So just one example of this is North Carolina. So North Carolina, has it used to have a Republican supermajority in its legislature. When it did have that, it tried to mess around with how the state Supreme Court justices were chosen. That backfired. That's kind of a long, convoluted story, but backfired. So now there is a majority of justices on the North Carolina Supreme Court who are elected or elected and appointed by Democrats. And so now the gerrymandering cases that have been in federal court, some of them are going to state court. And the Republicans are fighting as hard as they can to try to get those cases into federal court because they think federal courts are going to be more hospitable to their complaints against it. It's going to be a question as to whether or not federal courts are going to get involved. It's true that in Pennsylvania, the path to get review in federal court didn't work. But I tend to think that if this becomes a pattern of Democratic judges striking down Republican gerrymanders continues, then we're going to see the federal courts and the Supreme Court find federal issues, get involved, and start reining that in.
Yeah, and I can just to pick up on that North Carolina example. So the National Redistricting Foundation is supporting a lawsuit in state court in North Carolina, the suit that Rick just mentioned. And we did see a remand in December and got the case returned to state court under the theory that it is an exclusive question of state law that is being decided by state courts, and that the federal court system doesn't have any role to play in that process. It's the same strategy implemented in Pennsylvania. That question is now at the Fourth Circuit, so moving in the right direction. But of course, I do worry. It's one of the many things that keeps me up at night is whether the Supreme Court will ultimately find some little wiggle room into to find some federal question that they insist must be involved in this case, and therefore the case gets to move to federal court. It is, I do think, a focus. I think there's a lot of research and a lot of study being done on state constitutions. I think that's a very important thing for all of us to be doing and thinking about. And I think to the extent that there are avenues, even if, in a pessimistic view, at some point, maybe the Supreme Court will say enough's enough, we're going to come in and take this from you, that we should be simultaneously, notwithstanding that fear, moving forward on that front and hoping to make whatever progress we can make on a state level using state laws. There are a number of states like Pennsylvania, like North Carolina, that have these sort of free elections clauses, and where the state law has been interpreted to be more broad than the 14th Amendment, which is incredibly important, and that's one of the things that we should all be looking for in terms of, are there other examples, and where can we move to push on these issues in state courts and say, A, the federal court system has no right to sort of review this and take it away from the state court system, and B, the state court law is actually broader and has more protections than the federal law.
Yeah, and can I add that real quick?
Yeah.
And that's absolutely right. That in the Pennsylvania court's decision, the Supreme Court decision, there I think is a model for the rest of the country. 49 of the 50 state constitutions have an explicit grant of the right to vote in their state constitutions. The U.S. Constitution does not have an explicit grant, but 49 of the 50 states, the only one that doesn't is Arizona, and their courts have construed their free and equal clause to affirmatively grant the right to vote. So I think we can safely say that all 50 state constitutions do. The problem is that many of these state courts have done what's known as lockstep, or construed their state constitutions to be coextensive with the federal constitution, and I've argued that that is just wrong on a number of levels, and the courts that are construing their state constitutions to go beyond the federal constitution is correct doctrinally, and then I think it's about 25 or 26 states have either a free and equal or free and open clause with respect to their elections. So I think this is a really important area, especially with a federal judiciary that's not going to be as receptive to these claims, to focus on the state courts.
So I think this conversation moved naturally to gerrymandering, which is a bit of a crisis at the moment. So we're just going to continue on that trend, and I'm going to throw it right back to Marina here. Gerrymandering is an issue when it comes to Congress, and it's an issue at the state level. I think it's been an issue for decades, forever apparently, but certainly since 2010 we have seen Republicans, because they were the ones who came into power largely in that year, move forward with some really some gerrymanders that stick out as particularly effective. There were years in which Democrats won a majority of votes in Congress and yet a minority of seats, and we saw that it's in state legislatures as well. There are two big cases pending right now before the Supreme Court, and in a few weeks we'll know how they come out. One in North Carolina, the other in Maryland. So first, if you can just give us a really quick kind of lay of the land here of where we stand. I think we're at a turning point here, one way or the other. And then the second question is sort of after telling us where we are. is there a positive spin on where we can go, given that there are so many legal barriers to challenging the status quo? First among them, I think, the makeup of the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Thank you. So where we are now, I think the Supreme Court has been bumping up against this question for decades, and I do think we're at a tipping point. I think we're at a turning point. The question came back to the court last year, you'll all recall, with Gil v. Whitford out of Wisconsin, and before that it had been since 2004 over a question over Pennsylvania's redistricting scheme from the last decade, in which the court said, okay, well, four justices would say partisan gerrymandering claims are not for the federal judiciary. This is a political question, and we don't want anything to do with that. And Justice Kennedy said, well, this is not the case, but maybe there's a case in the future, and sort of left this door open. And that spurred, I think, a series of academics and people trying to sort of find the whatever shaped peg Justice Kennedy was looking for to put in whatever shaped hole he wanted to fill, and so there's been a whole host, a whole universe of study and research that's gone into this, and the efficiency gap was sort of developed, and all of these different partisan metrics or metrics to measure partisan bias have been developed, and so we got to Gil v. Whitford last year, and there was this sort of sense of, okay, maybe they'll do it, this is the time, and then the court said, well, one more thing, you can't have a statewide claim, it has to be district by district, so go back. So a lot of people, me among them, myself among them, do think that there's little chance that there's a punt here. I do think that if the court is ever going to address this issue, now is the time. We've got, the state by state, the district by district evidence that's been presented. There are two cases, as Pema mentioned, one out of Maryland, one out of North Carolina, for, to sort of please perhaps Justice Roberts in hope to be an institutionalist of some kind in his mind. There is a case that goes after a Democratic gerrymander and a case that goes after a Republican gerrymander. So, there is the opportunity for the court to seem like it is, not putting the thumb on the scale in a partisan way. There is in Maryland a case that's just about one congressional district. In North Carolina, it's the entire congressional district map. The litigators from the two cases have presented sort of a smorgasbord of here are the different options and the different standards that you could apply and the different metrics that you could use. And, it's sort of what last year during the oral argument in Gil v. Whitford, I think Justice Breyer said, can we just all get together and put all the options on a whiteboard and then we can sort of figure out what makes the most sense. And so that is actually, I think the litigators for these teams really took that to heart and really tried to sort of present to the court, here's everything you could possibly do. You have to do something. And I also think the evidence, in North Carolina, you have the state legislators openly admitting this is a partisan gerrymander. We don't think that's illegal, so that's what we're doing. So you're never going to get a more explicit expression of intent than we have in North Carolina. Maryland, there's similar deposition testimony from former Governor O'Malley, sort of admitting that was sort of the goal. So I think if we're ever going to get the court to do something on this question, now is the time. I think there are various ways that they could sort of try and make it the narrowest possible decision. And so I think my sort of room for optimism is that they do have to do something about this. I had been pessimistic about this question until more recently when the lower courts, so the 3-judge panels in Ohio and in Michigan, came down with their decisions. So we're now at 5 different courts, 5 different 3-judge panels have said partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional. So there's a lot of pressure on the Supreme Court to just say, doors are closed, you guys don't get to come in here, all of this is totally fine. So that has increased my optimism, though I tend to be a little bit of a pessimist when it comes to this. But so if I had to sort of put my money where my mouth is, I think we are probably most likely to just get, a sort of exceedingly narrow decision that requires some expression of explicit intent. but sort of tries to close the door a little bit. So we'll see how they do that.
Yeah, and I think just to I don't know how read up everyone is on these complex issues, but my understanding, and I think to sort of help explain what you were just getting at, is that racial gerrymandering, we've said for a long time, is not okay, but there hasn't been an explicit decision that partisan gerrymandering, even though it often lines up along racial lines, is also unconstitutional. And so I think that's sort of the question that we're talking about here, is whether or not you can just go out and say, well, my goal was to not let Republicans have a delegate, so I put them all in this little corner over here.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that the wild card here to me is the census case. These two things are not directly related.
This was my follow-up, so please
Oh,
go ahead.
sorry. Didn't mean to steal your thunder.
It's fine.
The question is about whether or not the administration violated the Administrative Procedure Act by putting the citizenship question on the census, claiming it was to help protect Latino voters and Voting Rights Act claims, when the evidence shows quite the opposite, that it was actually put on there to make it easier to discriminate against Hispanics and others in drawing district lines. If the court, as it appeared from oral argument, sides with the Trump administration and allows that question on, I actually think that bodes better for the redistricting cases than I otherwise would have thought, because then that would be two huge decisions where the court is dividing along ideological and partisan lines in ways that favor Republicans going into the next election. So I've come to believe that it's possible that what we will see is, just as Marina described, a kind of very narrow decision saying, North Carolina is extreme. Don't be like North Carolina. Everything else maybe is okay. We'll address that another time. But the two are not legally related, but they might be politically related.
Yeah, I'm curious on two fronts there. One is, I think, when we talk about this census case, we're talking immediately about, will people fill out the form, and therefore will states with large immigrant communities and lots of people who are tied to those communities, will they not report, and therefore those places will not have as much representation in 2020 and beyond. And then secondly, when you don't say, hey, we're here, you don't get the federal resources. So those are sort of like the immediate non-voting things that, well, they're voting related, but those are the immediate things that people are talking about. But I'm also, curious, I think that as we learned in the past week, this actually originated with someone whose specialty was gerrymandering. And so I am curious when it comes to, after the census in 2020, we're redrawing the maps all over again. It's a decennial thing we do. Do you see that decision tying into how maps are drawn? And also, I'm curious, if you're right and the Supreme Court does sort of carve out some little narrow, off-limits area for gerrymandering, do you see that actually stopping states from going far in 2020, or do you think it's in their interest to just say, we're going to do something extreme and we'll let the courts decide in, 8 years by the time it gets there whether or not we've gone too far?
Yeah, I think we're not going to have state legislators openly saying, I am partisan gerrymandering. I think that will probably tone it down just the tiniest bit, but not too much. But, the two issues are 100% related, and the revelations last week were sort of evidence of, I think, what we all suspected all along, which was there is so the main crux of the census citizenship question litigation and the questions before the Supreme Court right now are sort of how the undercount plays into how the administration thought about, and how that the fact that scientists at the Census Bureau said, data scientists said, this will cause an undercount, and Secretary Ross made his decision anyway, that sort of whether or not that is a violation of the APA or the Enumerations Clause. But there's a multiplier of that, is that that sort of one of the motivations, if not the original motivation for putting the citizenship question on the census, is the ability of the Republican Party to then gerrymander through the use of implementing the use of citizen voting age population as the population base from which you cut people up and carve up the districts, as opposed to total population. The idea being, as exposed from a memo last week, that that you can pack more people into urban districts, and then you sort of have additional individual people who are in those districts who have not been counted, either because they were afraid to be counted, or they are sort of removed by being non-citizens, and so then you're sort of creating these massive urban districts and sort of shifting political power into the rural areas. And so that is a multiplier on top of the undercount. So if you have the undercount and it causes sort of skewed apportionment, and then you times that by 2, because then you're also drawing the districts in a way that removes non-citizens completely. You're sort of it's one issue on top of the next. And so I think another case that we can probably anticipate seeing in the next few years, assuming that the court does say that it is okay for the citizenship question to be on the census, that will have a sort of revamp of a case called Evanwell, which several years back the court said that in response to a challenge against the use of total population, the court said, no, total population is okay, but left open the question of whether another type of population data point or use of population data would be acceptable for states to use for redistricting. So will it be acceptable for a state to use citizen voting age population on a statewide basis to redistrict? And that is a to be determined question at this point. We've already seen states try and move in that direction, so it's something we're watching very closely, but that's another sort of fight on the horizon that will probably, unfortunately, be in federal court. So.
And I think we have a little more time on this question, so I'm curious. I think sometimes people wonder, and as maybe especially people in this room at this conference, they sort of go, oh, apportionment based on only the citizen population sounds bad, but I can't totally put my finger on why. So I think for anyone on the panel, if you guys can just sort of talk about maybe in the less legalistic terms, but more sort of what would it be about that change that is objectionable, or how would that sort of skew our democracy?
Well, one thing, it would exclude children. Forget non-citizens, right? It would be voter-eligible population. And so if we think about legislators, who do they represent? Do they only represent voters? Well, I'd like to think that they represent the children of voters as well. I mean, I would extend it to non-eligible felons and non-citizens who live in a district, that those are being represented. But I think the case is easiest with children, to make the point. And I made this point, something I wrote in Slate last week. Even if there is a good argument to draw districts with equal numbers of eligible voters, if you're doing it in order to decrease the voting power of a racial group, that seems like a bad purpose. So forget, we can have a kind of a philosophical discussion about what does one person, one vote mean, and people have been doing this for 50 years. If your purpose is to suppress the vote and dilute the power of Hispanic voters, that seems to be to take it off the table.
That makes sense. So I'll move on to the next question here. And so we've been giving you guys a lot of super specific things, specific cases, specific reforms. And so I want to sort of take a step back a little bit, because I think that to do a panel on flipping the narrative, I think we have to sort of talk about what that narrative is and what it should be, and how do we expand it, and sort of take a little bit of a 20,000-foot view of the problem here. So I'm going to go to Bertrand. What are some of the bigger changes that academics and attorneys and law students and activists should be sort of thinking about to sort of more not just say okay, now you can vote from home, or you can vote the third Sunday before, but how do you take this up a little bit? And I think another way to put that is, what are the underlying structures or laws that are inhibiting people from fully participating in the democratic process?
Thank you, Pema. I just want to start by saying how deeply confusing I find it to be on a panel about optimism with Rick Hassan on it. It was just when I talked to Josh about the panel's orientation,
not Survivor.
I was like, well, what's Rick doing here?
The ACS believes in balance.
Exactly. Here's our balance on the panel. So I guess I want to start with maybe an unusual starting point for a non-academic audience and a progressive-leaning audience, rational choice theory. And just stick with me. I know this you guys are ready to pick up your phone, see who texted you. Nobody's texted you in the last minute, so stick with me. All right, so rational choice theory kind of introduces three relevant terms for voting. One is the cost of voting, one's the benefit of voting, to voting, and one's the probability of casting a decisive vote. Now, rational choice theory has been heavily criticized. Rick has heavily criticized it. I have criticisms towards it. It's a little bit too individualistic-minded. Voting, I think, is a social action. I think that they don't account for irrational factors such as people have a sense of duty to vote, which isn't properly accounted for in rational choice theory. And the probability term, probability of casting a decisive vote term, doesn't really accord with voting behavior because people vote most in presidential elections where they're least likely to cast a decisive vote than local elections where they're more likely to cast a decisive vote. So there are all kinds of problems with the theory that I don't want to ignore or overlook, but I still think it's a helpful way of framing the conversation and thinking about sort of where we are in terms of participation. Now, the costs of voting since over the last 50 plus years have gone down. Now, I know that there have been blips, and we are in a moment of blip in which new barriers are being erected and such. But if you think about it, since the Voting Rights Act forward, the costs of voting have gone down quite a bit, quite significantly. And yet, the percentage of people participating in voting hasn't gone up significantly. And what that suggests is that there's something else going on. And I think this something else going on is particularly relevant to marginalized communities that I care about and write about a lot in my own research. And what I think the problem is has to do with the other two parts of that equation. And I'll focus first on the benefits to voting. If people do not perceive that voting will make a difference in their lives, in the sense that candidate A or candidate B is not going to improve my life in any significant way, or they have no information or knowledge that would indicate that they would change their lives in any significant way, people are not going to vote. You can reduce the cost of voting to zero, and those people will still not vote because they see no benefit from voting. And then the second term, probability. If their sense is that their vote will not matter in the sense that the election is so non-competitive that they will not be able to influence the outcome in any particular way, you can reduce the cost of voting to zero and people will still not vote. So when you're thinking about reforms, I think in terms of targeting those other two terms, not to say that we should ignore the cost term, we should still continue to fight the fight. We should still continue to push for voting rights. We should still push to reduce that cost term to zero. But we have to shift our focus to these other two terms. Now, from the benefit perspective, I think an important part of the benefit perspective is giving people information, letting them know in terms of what these candidates stand for and how what these candidates stand for will impact their lives. And the way that this is done traditionally is through a couple different mechanisms. Right? One mechanism is just throw an ad up on TV. Right? For many people, that's just white noise. Right? They'll flip the channel. TV ads don't really say that much. It really doesn't give a sense of how this candidate is relevant to my own life. Another is to send mailers out. Right? And we get tons of these mailers. And what do we do with these mailers? We usually put them in the trash, and if we're environmentally conscious, we'll put them in recycling. All right? But they're not going to necessarily impact the way people think about elections or give people a sense that they matter, that this election matters to them. So what Alan Gerber and Don Green did with an experiment back in 2000 is try to assess the effects of canvassing, door-to-door canvassing, on people's voting behavior. And what they found was something quite remarkable. They found through an experiment that door-to-door canvassing increased the likelihood of an individual to vote by 6 to 8%. And not only that, it had indirect effects, because if we understand voting as social behavior, and if we understand that individuals vote because their friends, their families, their members of the communities vote as well, to the extent that you are contacting a person and influencing them to vote, you are also indirectly influencing their neighbors, their friends, their families to vote as well. Now, this is canvassing that goes through a scripted sort of type of canvassing. I don't know how many of you have worked on campaigns. I know that when you work on campaigns, you're given a script. You read that script to people. You tell them to vote. You tell them where to vote. Yeah, you feel good, right? Do I have your commitment to vote? Yeah, I'm going to vote, man. Yeah, right? And some of those people come out to vote and some don't. But for marginalized communities, it's going to take a little bit more effort. For marginalized communities, it's engaging them. It's talking to them. It's getting a sense of what their problems are, getting a sense of how they getting a sense of how they understand the political process, and engaging in a conversation with them about what their candidate is about and how it relates directly to their lives that goes off script. Because even the scripted behavior is not going to, scripted contact is not going to have as much an effect on voting behavior if you don't have the ability to connect with marginalized communities who are disengaged from political process in a more direct, targeted way. And the problem right now is that we're moving away from that, right? And the reason why we're moving away from that is because campaigns are engaging in rational choice calculations. And their rational choice calculation is, I want to target the voters that are going to be least costly to target to influence to vote. And so what they're doing is plugging into their data profiles, into their algorithms, some information about the likelihood that people will vote based on their past voting behavior, their partisan propensity, et cetera, and making decisions about who to contact. And often they're not contacting members of these marginalized communities because they are going to cost more and they're going to mobilize, and the results from mobilizing them are a bit more uncertain. And so one of the things you think about in terms of structural change is, how do we change the incentive structure for campaigns to engage these voters, to give them a sense of the benefit to voting that will, I think, have an impact on turnout, or at least experimental studies show that it does. The other part of the equation, the probability. Now, in the gerrymandering context, the focus has been on how do we sort of create a more symmetric or fair state legislature, in the sense of how do we make sure that the proportion of Democrats and the proportion of Republicans reflects the proportion of Republicans and proportion of Democrats in the state. And let's just say we get success on that. Let's just kind of really be optimistic, right? And Justice Roberts says, this is a dastard problem. We cannot allow this to happen. You must ensure some level of symmetry. Now think about the incentives for state legislatures and how they're going to respond. I think what they're likely to respond and say is, okay, we'll give you symmetry. We'll give you symmetry through the drawing of a bunch of safe districts for both parties. And so what does safe districts mean? It means non-competitive elections. And what does that mean for people that live in those districts? If you're part of the minority party, your vote doesn't really mean that much in those particular elections. And we might be willing to sacrifice that because we've got proportionality at that level. But if our focus is on increasing participation, we've just reduced the likelihood that those marginalized communities will vote, because their sense of probability that their vote matters is going to go down. And so when I think of sort of reform at the gerrymandering level, I think about it also in terms of increasing the competitiveness of elections. Some elections you cannot control in terms of competitiveness. They're at the state level for governor, they're at state level for senators, but most elections in the country are district-based elections. And maybe in a place like the Bay Area of California, there's no way to draw a competitive district. But in many parts of the country, there are. And to the extent that you can draw and create more competitive electoral environment, then we can leverage the fact of Citizens United and the flood of money in a way that could be positive, in the sense that campaigns use that money to mobilize those marginalized communities. And so when I think about reform, I think about focusing on the benefit term and the probability term as a way to move forward to a significant increased participation in our political process.
I'm curious, and I want to throw this to everyone. Just to sort of think about, like he just did, bigger ways to think about this. If you're trying to draw competitive districts and you're in Berkeley, and that's going to be difficult, is there an argument for not doing districts at all?
So there's an argument for sure. There are costs. I mean, I think the reason that I favored single-member districts and reason why the court has enforced and required in many instances single-member districts is due to the Voting Rights Act, and to try to increase the opportunities for racial minorities to win elections in ways that they were not able to do so in the at-large context in many states, particularly in the South. And I do think that there is still remain value in that. What I would do is not necessarily get rid of districts, but get rid of or reduce the requirement of compactness. I think compactness is a traditional districting principle that serves less of a role or a function in today's political climate or today's technological context, in which people in districts are able to connect with each other, connect with their legislators in ways that do not require that they live necessarily all close together. So if you reduce the sort of value of compactness, then you can draw districts that are more competitive by extending districts in ways that may look grotesque in terms of a map and gerrymandering. Oh my gosh, that looks awful. But it could serve a valuable function of creating this competitive electoral environment.
You look like
I was just saying, it creates trade-offs, you know. So in Berkeley, I went to undergraduate in Berkeley, so I know it's, you know, it's Democrats versus socialists. So there are two parties.
That's true.
There's something to be said if you live in Berkeley or in the most conservative part of Orange County to have a representative who reflects the majority of what people want. All right, so it's a trade-off. So if you have to draw a district that takes Berkeley with, I don't know, Walnut Creek and Orinda, I mean, I don't know. So, you know, you maybe you're going to have a lot of swings and you may have a different sense of representation. I'd rather move to multi-member districts and ranked choice voting. So, you know, to take the state of Massachusetts where, you know, you've got 9 members of Congress. They're all Democrats. You've got 30% of the state who are Republicans who get no representation at all. If you made Massachusetts into 3 triple-member districts, which currently you'd have to change a federal statute to do that, you'd have a better chance of having some proportionality, whatever it is. And if you couple that with ranked choice voting, you can give people a way to kind of fundamentally change the way that elections take place, provide for more proportionality without fully taking away the geographical basis. I think it does raise potential Voting Rights Act problems that would have to be dealt with. But if those can be solved, I think we can think more creatively. And Josh's look on the state and local level, I think, unlike Congress, gives you more of a variety of things we could be looking at.
So I was going to respond to something slightly different that Bertrand said, which was the need to reach voters to not only break down barriers, but to convince them of the importance. And so I'll very quickly tell one of my favorite stories involving taco trucks. In Houston, a group called Mi Familia Vota went to heavily Latino areas of Houston and brought voter registration forms to taco trucks and said, distribute them to your customers. And it was widely popular. It was extremely popular among Latino communities. And and Texas has a restrictive voter registration deadline. I think it's 30 days before the election. And these are areas of the town that had never really had any outreach. Election officials didn't really go there. Campaigns didn't go there. But this democracy reform group did. And in fact, on the voter registration deadline, taco truck owners were calling the state director of Mi Familia Vota and saying, bring us more voter registration forms because we're running out. And the result was that turnout went up in those neighborhoods the election when this was used. So I love, maybe just because I love tacos, I love this story. But I think it's a great example of what Bertrand was talking about with respect to actually going to these areas, especially do so with minority communities, that can make a real difference.
I think that, so I have a final question for the panel here, and I think what we've just been talking about moves really nicely into it, so maybe the conversation doesn't change that much, but I want to sort of bring us down to like the most nitty-gritty practical level here. There's a saying, you don't want to fight yesterday's battles, but you also don't want to be caught flat-footed when the same thing happens again. So I think particularly for the people in the room, the lawyers, the activists, the students. What are some things that you think folks can do or work on or favor when we have an election that's 17 months away, and we just had one also, you know, in the rearview mirror 7 months behind us, and we know that there are going to be signature match problems, and there are going to be voter roll purges, and, you know, maybe just going out there with the taco trucks and the voter registration forms is the best way to make sure that people can get to the polls. Maybe there are lawsuits. So I'm curious for all of you to sort of to jump in any way and sort of talk about, you know, how do we, having just seen all of the issues in the midterms, how do we decrease the likelihood that that happens again?
I mean, I'll just say that, you know, a lot of folks in this room probably work for a campaign, one or the other, that's out there. And if not, maybe they'll have friends or others that are working with these campaigns. And I think campaigns have an important role to play in creating a more inclusive democracy. And I think that pushing back against data-driven algorithmic canvassing would be a positive step in the right direction. And maybe the campaign doesn't want to devote, and perhaps they see it as dump a bunch of resources and low probability voters, but there are other things that can be done. And Josh's example of sort of at least providing the logistics of how to vote and making those logistics easier and engaging people with and giving them a sense that you care that they vote could matter to communities in terms of their turnout. So I think that at the ground level, it may not be sort of changing laws, but it could be changing behavior of campaigns. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, we're going to have to think about is, you know, pushing back against these anti-harvesting campaigns or laws that more Republican states are putting up that are trying to limit the ability of different voter groups to operate in different states with respect to registration activity or collecting ballots to bring them to whatever the polling station might be. So there are things that we need to think creatively about because one of the success stories is California in terms of turnout in the 2018 election and in terms of midterm election. And one of the reasons for it was because of the vote by mail combined with harvesting that, or sort of, I don't want to call it harvesting because I know it's a bad term for it, but the collection of ballots that put more people's voices and votes into the political system. So I think that working through at the campaign level could be quite valuable.
Go ahead.
Well, one, just in the following the theme of flipping the narrative, one thing that we were discussing a little bit before the panel started was just even the narrative around these sort of very wonky election administration issues, signature mismatch, list maintenance, redistricting, you know, all of these sort of very technical issues, and sort of reframing them as, you know, I infuriatingly heard a journalist who I think is wonderful, but she was on television and talking about Georgia in the last election and said, well, these are election administration issues. It's not about voter suppression. And I nearly threw my television. But just reframing that, I mean, it absolutely is voter suppression for the Secretary of State, who also happens to be running for governor, to manage the election system in a way that is so biased and really does put a thumb on the scale. And so just for all of us to reframe our thinking about those really technical issues, and to the extent that it moves people, it moves voters, it moves folks to talk about it as voter suppression, because that's a thing that resonates with people a lot better and a lot easier than, you know, oh, well, it's about, you know, voter purge or list maintenance, or it's about, you know, vote by mail, signature, you know, mismatch questions, to really just centralize that and say this is about voter suppression and how we administer, how a state administer and localities administer elections on a wholesale scale. It really is whether you're making access to the ballot difficult or whether you're making it easy. And so just trying to simplify those issues in a meaningful way for folks.
Really quick, I want Josh and Rick to get in here, but we are about time for audience questions. So if anyone does have a question, you can go ahead and line up so that we can get that process moving, because time marches on. So yeah, but.
So just to push back a little bit, I think that there's a danger that talking a lot about voter suppression is actually demobilizing. And there's some social science that suggests that talking about the election being rigged actually worked against the interests of the left in the last election. But I do think that this is an election where voting rights is going to be a campaign issue in a way that it wasn't before. I mean, Hillary Clinton talked about it a little bit, but I think it's going to be, the way we're going to talk about education, healthcare, the environment. I think voting rights is going to be a central issue, and that it's going to be something that people mobilize around because they see things like Georgia and they're outraged by it.
So, this panel is talking about flipping the narrative, which is something that I've been trying to do with respect to the doom and gloom that's out there. And my fear is that when you hear so much doom and gloom, which again exists, the reaction is to throw up your hands and say, the system is rigged. And instead, my hope is that people not only fight back against the voter suppression, but sometimes it feels like we're playing whack-a-mole, right? You hit one back and another thing pops up in its place, but instead to also go on the offense. Bertrand mentioned, many of you may be working on campaigns. In addition to that, there are nonpartisan democracy reform groups in every single state working on these issues. And my appendix actually has a list of all 50 states and organizations in each one. And so my hope is that we actually do go on the offense and flip the narrative and say, okay, let's join one of these groups or let's spend an hour a week working on one of these issues so that we can promote positive voting rights reforms to coincide with the pushback against voter suppression. I think having some hope in this dark era is needed and is really the path forward.
Awesome, thank you. So let's jump in with audience questions here. Just for the purpose of getting through all of the questions and due to time constraints, try to, be snappy with them just so that we can have our long-winded responses.
I'll be snappy. Is this on? Can everybody hear me? Yeah. All right. My question is about election security. In New York, they are about to approve the XL voting machine, which creates a barcode and in some cases doesn't even have a person use a pen or anything to choose. It's a touch screen. And in some jurisdictions, we're seeing the use of wireless modems to take the voter information and put it and to record it. All of these are insecure, and I think it has something to do with the rational choice theory and the fact that people believe even if they do turn up and even if they do vote, their vote will literally not be counted or changed. So thoughts on that?
I do think there's the newest wave of voting machines are so-called BMDs, ballot marking devices that produce a barcode. I think that there's a dispute now about how secure they are and whether they're auditable. If we were a rational democracy, we would have a national standard that would be vetted by scientists, but we don't. So we have instead a state-by-state slog over these issues. And I think people have to be vigilant to make sure that things are auditable and are actually audited every election. There need to be post-election random audits to make sure that our vote counting machinery is actually reflecting people's will.
The slightly good news is that the states that have moved to universal vote by mail, it's a paper system, and which is much more verifiable, and that's a real growth area.
Yeah, but I do think there's probably for the lawyers here, I think that if you have a system that people think is insecure, there are going to be lawsuits over it. So I don't know if they're going to go anywhere, but I do think we're starting to see some even constitutional challenges to systems that are super hackable, for lack of a better phrase.
And I just one final point is I'll say that we need to think about the reasons why we are not, or at least one party is not paying that much attention to ballot insecurity. And I think that insecurity as a strategy of demobilization is something that we need to keep our minds on, because it is those who are most marginalized that are going to be less willing to vote if they really deem that it's a very insecure process. And so it's something that we're going to have to address in some way.
So my question is about the tension between some really great reforms and the reality of how long it takes to implement. So I serve on the board of California Common Cause, and I also advise the County of Santa Clara's Registrar of Voters. And so we have these great ideas and fantastic reforms like vote by mail and same-day voter registration and things of that nature, but it also actually takes the Registrar of Voters a very long time to count the ballots as a result of those things. And so what happens on election night versus what actually is the result of the election are different, which then causes, I think, folks out there in the world who don't pay as much attention as folks in this room to think that there's something wrong going on behind the scenes, and to be wary of reforms like ranked choice voting, because on election night you're not going to have the answer. Like, it's going to take us 30 days to get all of the vote by mail votes in, because we're going to do signature mismatch verification, and we're going to do all these other things. We can't actually do the ranked choice counting until we have all of the ballots. And so I just want to hear about how you think about the ways in which some of these reforms mean that our elections administration just takes more time, and so election night reporting makes it seem as if there's something wrong with the system.
Well, if it messes with CNN, then I'm not for it.
Fair enough.
I'm kidding.
I think we need transparency in the process and educating people. So I look, for example, in Orange County, that's where a lot of the votes looked like they were Republican votes for Congress on Election Day, and they turned out to be Democratic votes at the end. The registrar there is Neil Kelly, who's a Republican. He was very transparent. He had media in there. He had people in there. He explained the process. He explained how many votes were left to be counted. You can contrast that, for example, with Brenda Snipes, who was Broward County, Florida's election administrator, who had to be sued by Rick Scott to find out how many ballots were left. I think having transparency in education and calling out people like Paul Ryan, the former Speaker of the House, who called it extremely bizarre that the vote totals were changing in California. It wasn't bizarre at all. So you have millions of ballots that need to be counted that have come in. It's going to take time. So education and transparency, I think, are the best tools.
Yeah, and I think the media does play a role. I think that, CNN getting it wrong enough will perhaps change behavior in terms of reporting things and needing to report things in real immediate times. I just remind you of the Affordable Care Act decision. When the first part of it was read, there was banners on CNN and Fox News saying that the Affordable Care Act had been overturned, and then a couple minutes later they switched that to say it had been upheld. So I think that you would hope that media mistakes and some of the reputational costs that come from that will lead the media to be a little bit more patient when thinking about elections going forward.
So I'm a law student out in Colorado, and we're working on participation reform out there. And one of the most common rebuttals we hear from people who aren't so interested is that we have consistently some of the easiest voting in the country and some of the highest turnout in federal elections. So why do we need to do anything? And I'm curious what you would say, or what you would recommend in terms of pushing back on the narrative of because we're one of the best, that's good enough.
Yeah, and Colorado is in many ways a model, but that's only because of reforms that have happened within the past decade or so, right? When you have the vote center model in Colorado, which started, as I mentioned, in Larimer County and then spread to the rest of the state, and universal vote by mail, so you have this combination system. But I think the message of how you push back of we don't need to do any better is when you look at the numbers and you still have, 40% of the people not showing up, whether it's in, you look at midterm, you look at local elections, I don't know the exact numbers for local elections in Colorado, but I'm guessing it's less than 50%.
We had a record high at 39%.
Right. So the message is when you have 61% of the people not showing up, then maybe our system isn't as good as you might think. And you can compare it to models in other countries and what have you. And I think, when people hear that you flip the number and you say, well, 39 participated, that's a record. When you flip it and say 61% didn't participate, that to me resonates a lot.
I think in the short term, we're going to have the opposite problem. Michael McDonald, who runs the election project at the University of Florida, who follows voter turnout as closely as anyone in the country, has predicted that we're going to have a turnout tsunami, like a 100-year flood in the 2020 elections, because people are on both sides are going to be very energized. And so really the question is, are election administrators prepared to handle the long lines and the floods? And you can bet that there are going to be certain parts of certain states where the voting machines are going to break down and the lines are going to be too long. And so things need to be done now to make sure that there's fairness and equity in how those machines are put out there, because that can skew the outcome of a vote.
Can you even do court orders ahead of time if you're worried about?
I actually,
something?
and I've for a long time said it's much easier and better for courts to resolve problems before an election, before you know who the winner is, than afterwards. And so you need to go in there and look and say, look, this ballot is confusing. people are not going to be able to figure out where the Senate race is, as we saw in the Florida Senate race? Or why is it that Cleveland is getting the old broken down voting machines while in the suburbs they're getting the new ones? You know, that needs to happen before the election, not after.
Right.
Yes, I'm wondering if there's any thought about potentially growing the size of legislatures because, say, for the United States Congress, we've not grown the size of the Congress for over 100 years while the United States population has tripled. So I'm wondering how you think that would involve improving democracy.
It's a great question. It's something I've been thinking about quite a bit. Just comparing the size of the House of Commons to the size of Congress, House of Commons is larger than Congress, and yet England has a lot fewer people. There was an original reason for the smallness of the House of Representatives. It was part of the design of the founders to make sure only the people with the most reputation who were part of this kind of natural aristocracy would get elected. So by drawing these big electoral districts, those with lesser means would less likely to be able to win elections for the House of Representatives. And that seems to be playing out now. I think that there is a case to be made. One of the arguments against it is that it makes it unwieldy as a political process. If we think our process is unwieldy now in terms of being able to get anything done, then would making the legislature bigger make that problem worse? Or would it make it better by adding new elements? I mean, one thing that you have in England, you have more than 2 parties at play. Here, we only have 2 parties. So would making it bigger actually make a sizable and significant difference in terms of getting things done and getting better representation, or would it make it worse and creating a more unwieldy process? Those are kind of the parts of the debates that need to be addressed.
I think we have 1 minute and 1 more question, so let's do it.
All right, so there are a couple mentions about how talking about the system being broken can disenfranchise or demotivate populations, especially minority populations. As someone who works in an organization that tries to motivate marginalized communities to vote, how do you best express the need for reform and the kind of crisis that a lot of minority populations are in, while at the same time not demotivating them or marginalizing them further?
I think framing in terms of fighting for your voting rights makes the most sense. So I think of the example in North Dakota in the 2018 election, which passed a law that required residential proof of a residential address, which affected only one population, which was the Native American population, many of whom lived in areas that did not have these addresses. And in response, you saw money pour in to these communities to actually send people with printers to print tribal ID cards with residential addresses in the days before the election, and turnout, actually ended up going up there. I think you can use it as a reason for mobilization, that people should not allow their votes to be taken away, and not just complain about suppression, but offer ways to get around it. So there are groups like Vote Riders, which goes to states that have trouble with people getting IDs and helps them get the IDs. So going to court and fighting over the very strict matching rules, that led to improvements in Georgia. Not good enough, but better. So I think that there are things to do to fight for your voting rights as opposed to just yelling about suppression.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming and being part of this.